Welcome to our deep dive into the life of King Solomon. It's fascinating to me how we often remember historical figures for just one thing, like Solomon and his wisdom. But their lives were so much more complex than that, and the sources you provided really paint a full picture, not just of the man, but of the world he lived in.
Absolutely. What we have here is a mix of historical accounts and personal reflections that reveal a leader who is both brilliant and flawed. Someone who experienced incredible highs and crushing lows, and whose choices had ripple effects that impacted not just his own life, but the fate of an entire nation.
Okay, let's start at the beginning. Solomon's very name means peace, yet he inherited a kingdom that was anything but peaceful. Talk about setting the stage for conflict.
It really does highlight the inherent challenges he faced from day one. Solomon was also the second son, born after the tragic death of his older brother. This sets a backdrop of forgiveness and reconciliation, themes that echo throughout Solomon's reign.
And then there's the advice from his father, King David on his deathbed. Follow God's laws to ensure a successful reign. Wow. Talk about pressure, like a blueprint for success or a warning of what could happen if he strayed from that path.
David's advice underscores the prevailing belief system of the time, that obedience to God was directly linked to the well-being of the nation. It wasn't just a personal matter of faith, it was a political and social imperative. So Solomon was carrying the weight of that expectation on his shoulders from the very beginning.
And then we get to that iconic scene. God appears to Solomon in a dream and offers him anything he desires. Now, put yourself in his sandals for a second.
Right.
What would you ask for? A mountain of gold, an invincible army.
I think that's the question that has captivated people for centuries. It speaks to our own desires, our own values. What would W.E. prioritize if given such an extraordinary opportunity? But Solomon, he chooses wisdom.
Wisdom, of all the things he could have asked for. He asked for wisdom to rule justly.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense, right? A wise ruler can navigate tricky situations, make sound judgments, keep the peace.
Yes. But think about it in the context of that era. Wisdom wasn't just about being smart. It was about having the discernment to interpret God's will and apply it to the complexities of leadership. Justice was seen as a divine mandate, not just a human construct. So by asking for wisdom, Solomon was essentially aligning himself with God's authority and promising to rule in accordance with divine principles.
That's a really interesting point. It wasn't just about being clever. It was about a deeper understanding of right and wrong, of how to lead in a way that pleased God and benefited his people.
Exactly. And God is clearly pleased with Solomon's request because he grants him not only wisdom, but also unimaginable wealth and honor. It's almost as if God is saying, yes, you understand what truly matters. Here's everything you need to create a flourishing kingdom.
Talk about a divine reward. And this blessing sets the stage for Solomon's legendary achievements, right? Like the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. This magnificent structure that was a long-held dream of his father David.
The temple was more than just a building. It was the physical embodiment of God's presence among his people. It was a symbol of national unity, religious devotion, and Solomon's commitment to fulfilling his father's legacy.
The sources mention some pretty impressive details about the temple. 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. And get this, only stones cut from the quarry were used. No noisy tools allowed on site. It seems like every aspect of its construction was designed to reflect reverence and awe.
Absolutely. Even the construction process itself was imbued with symbolic meaning. The absence of metal tools on site emphasized the sanctity of the space. It's almost like they were trying to create an atmosphere of peace and harmony, even during the construction process, which mirrors Solomon's name and his initial goal for the kingdom.
And then there's that beautiful prayer Solomon offers at the temple's dedication. It's so humble, it's so full of gratitude. It really highlights his devotion to God at this point in his life.
Yes, and it reveals a key aspect of Solomon's understanding of leadership. He acknowledges that even with all his wisdom and power, he is ultimately a servant of God. He's not claiming credit for the temple's splendor. He's giving all the glory to God.
There's one line that really stood out to me. Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below you, who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continue wholeheartedly in your way. It's almost like he's reflecting that advice his father gave him, that staying true to God is the key to everything good.
That's a great observation. There's a clear connection between the advice David gives Solomon and the prayer he offers at the temple's dedication. It's like a full circle moment, showing Solomon at the height of his power, wisdom, and piety.
But here's where the story takes that fascinating turn, right? Solomon's downfall begins with his many foreign wives, 700 wives and 300 concubines.
Yeah.
Even with all his wisdom, Solomon couldn't resist certain temptations. It's almost like even the wisest among us can have these blind spots.
Yes. And this is where the story gets really interesting. These marriages weren't simply matters of the heart. They were often political alliances designed to strengthen Solomon's position in the region.
So there was strategy involved,
Mm.
not just temptation.
Exactly. But the consequences were still significant. These foreign wives brought their own gods and religious practices with them, and Solomon, perhaps trying to appease them, or maybe even out of genuine curiosity, allowed these foreign deities to be worshipped alongside the God of Israel.
Wait, so he built this magnificent temple to honor God, but then allowed other gods to be worshipped in his kingdom. That seems like a pretty big contradiction.
It is a major turning point in Solomon's story. It's the beginning of his straying from the path his father had so clearly laid out for him. And the sources make it clear that this deviation from God's law would have major consequences, not just for Solomon personally, but for the entire kingdom.
It's more than just a personal failing. It's a national crisis in the making.
Exactly. And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive, exploring the consequences of Solomon's choices and the legacy he ultimately left behind.
This is getting really intriguing. I can't wait to see how it all unfolds.
You know, it's fascinating how the sources capture not just the political and religious drama of Solomon's reign, but also his internal struggles. And that's where the book of Ecclesiastes comes in.
Ah, Ecclesiastes. It's almost like listening to a king's therapy session, right? Here's this man who seemingly had it all: wisdom, power, wealth, and yet he's wrestling with this profound sense of emptiness.
That's what makes it so relatable. Even thousands of years later, Solomon in Ecclesiastes systematically deconstructs what we might consider traditional markers of success. He explores pleasure, knowledge, hard work, even artistic pursuits, and concludes that on their own, they don't bring lasting fulfillment.
There's that famous line, meaningless, everything is meaningless. Talk about a bleak outlook. But it's not just negativity, right? There's wisdom hidden in there too.
Exactly. It's not a rejection of those things entirely, but rather a recognition of their limitations. Solomon, remember, had the resources to indulge in every conceivable pleasure the sources mention. Male and female singers harem the delights of a man's heart. Imagine the parties this guy could throw.
Wow. I'm putting it mildly. But even surrounded by all that, he still felt empty. So
Yeah.
what's the takeaway here? Is he saying we should all just become hermits and give up on worldly pursuits?
Not at all. The key is understanding what Solomon calls chasing after the wind. It's about recognizing when our desires become fixations, when we're seeking fulfillment in things that can't ultimately satisfy us.
Okay. I'm starting to see where this connects to his earlier choices. Maybe those foreign wives and their gods weren't just a political strategy. Maybe they were also part of that chasing after the wind, a way to fill the void he was feeling, even with all the success he achieved.
That's a really insightful connection, and it brings up a crucial question. What are the modern equivalents of these foreign gods? What are the Uri chasing after that might be leading us down a similar path of emptiness?
That's a great question. It makes you think about our own priorities. Is it status, material possessions, that constant need for validation on social media? Maybe these have become our foreign gods, the things we turn to for fulfillment, but ultimately leave us wanting more.
And this is where Solomon's wisdom, even in his struggles, shines through. Because after dissecting all these worldly pursuits, he arrives at the simple yet profound conclusion. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth.
Wait, so after all that existential angst, he's basically saying, just remember God. That seems kind of anticlimactic after all of the building.
It might seem simple, but it's not simplistic. Remember, this is coming from a man who had experienced the heights of worldly success and found them wanting. He's not speaking from a place of naive idealism. He's speaking from experience.
So it's not just about avoiding bad things. It's about actively cultivating a relationship with something greater than ourselves. And that can be through faith, through service to others, through connecting with nature, whatever resonates with the listener, right?
Sure. Precisely. The remember your Creator part is open to interpretation. It's about aligning ourselves with a source of meaning and purpose that transcends the fleeting nature of worldly pursuits. And for Solomon, that source was his faith in God.
And that ties back to the advice his father David gave him about following God's laws for a successful reign. It's like this thread that runs through Solomon's entire life, from his early promise to his eventual downfall. And then with Ecclesiastes, we see him wrestling with the consequences of his choices, trying to make sense of it all.
It's a powerful reminder that even the wisest among us are on a journey with its ups and downs, its moments of brilliance and its moments of regret. And Solomon's story encourages us to reflect on our own journeys, to identify those foreign gods we might be chasing after, and to refocus our attention on what truly matters.
It's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, to lose sight of the bigger picture. But Solomon's story is a wake-up call, urging us to examine our priorities, to make sure we're not sacrificing our well-being, our values, for the sake of things that won't ultimately satisfy us.
And it's not just a cautionary tale, it's also a story of hope. Because even though Solomon strayed from his path, he ultimately came back to that fundamental truth. That true fulfillment lies in aligning ourselves with something greater than ourselves.
So even with all his missteps, Solomon's story can be a source of inspiration. It reminds us that it's never too late to course correct, to reevaluate our priorities, to seek out what truly nourishes our souls.
Absolutely. And that's something we can all relate to, regardless of our background or belief. We all have those moments where we feel lost, where we question our choices. But Solomon's story reminds us that even in those moments of darkness, there's always a path back to the light.
I love that, a path back to the light.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, the sources you provided mention that despite all his achievements, Solomon faced some serious pushback, adversaries, rebellions within his kingdom. It seems, even with all his wisdom, he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions.
That's a crucial point. Solomon's decision to turn away from the God of Israel had ripple effects that went far beyond his personal life. It destabilized the kingdom, leading to internal conflicts and external threats.
It's not just about our individual choices. It's about the impact those choices have on the world around us. It's like a reminder that we're all interconnected, that our actions have consequences that extend far beyond ourselves.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that central question we've been exploring. What can we learn from Solomon's mistakes to avoid similar pitfalls in our own lives?
We've been talking about King Solomon, his incredible rise, and the choices that led to his downfall. It's interesting how the sources present this arc, almost like a cautionary tale, but also a story of redemption. Where do things stand as Solomon's reign comes to a close?
Well, remember that prophecy, that warning from his father David about staying true to God's laws. The sources are pretty clear that Solomon straying from that path had major consequences.
Right, all those foreign wives and their gods. It wasn't just a personal failing, it impacted the whole kingdom.
Exactly. The kingdom, once unified and prosperous under Solomon's wise rule, faced growing internal tensions. There were rebellions, economic hardships, and a sense that Solomon had lost his way.
It's almost like a Greek tragedy, isn't it? The very wisdom that brought him so much success ultimately couldn't save him from the consequences of his own actions.
It's a reminder that even with great gifts, our choices have consequences. But it's not just about punishment. Remember Ecclesiastes, those reflections on meaning and emptiness? That's part of Solomon's legacy, too.
So even in his mistakes, he's offering us wisdom.
Absolutely. Solomon's wrestling with the big questions, the meaning of life, the pursuit of happiness, the fleeting nature of worldly success. Those are questions we're still grappling with today.
And it's not just philosophical pondering, right? The sources mention that toward the end of his life, Solomon faced some serious adversaries, enemies both within and outside the kingdom. It seems like things got pretty messy.
Yes, the kingdom was weakened by internal strife and vulnerable to external threats. It's a reminder that our personal choices can have ripple effects that impact those around us, even on a national scale.
It makes you think about our own world today. With all the political divisions and social unrest, are we, in a sense, repeating some of Solomon's mistakes?
Certainly a question worth pondering. Are we as a society chasing after the wrong things? Prioritizing short-term gains over long-term well-being? Are we neglecting the principles that lead to true peace and prosperity? Solomon's story challenges us to look inward, both individually and collectively, to examine our values and make sure they align with what truly matters.
It's like he's holding up a mirror to us, isn't it? Forcing us to confront not just his mistakes, but our own.
Precisely, and that's where his story transcends ancient history and becomes relevant to our lives today.
So despite the downfall, despite the consequences, Solomon leaves behind more than just a cautionary tale. He leaves behind wisdom that can help us navigate our own challenges, our own temptations, our own search for meaning.
Yes, and that wisdom is found not just in his early successes, but also in his struggles, his reflections, and ultimately in his return to seeking God. Remember, even though he strayed, he ultimately acknowledged the emptiness of his pursuits and sought to realign himself with his faith.
It's almost like even in his imperfection, he's showing us a path forward, that it's never too late to course correct, to reevaluate our priorities, to reconnect with what truly matters.
Exactly. Solomon's story is ultimately one of hope. A reminder that even when we make mistakes, even when we stray from our values, there's always a possibility of redemption, of finding our way back to a life of purpose and meaning.
This deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking. We started with this image of Solomon as the wise king, the builder of the temple,
Hmm.
and we've uncovered so much more. The complexities of his leadership, his internal struggles, the ripple effects of his choices.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about real people grappling with real challenges, making choices that shape the course of their lives and the lives of those around them.
And Solomon's story, more than anything, is a story about being human. It's about the potential for greatness, the vulnerability to temptation, the struggle to find meaning in a world that often feels confusing and contradictory.
And that's why his story resonates with us, even thousands of years later. Because we all share that same human experience, that same longing for purpose, that same capacity for both wisdom and folly.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the life of King Solomon, what's the one takeaway you'd like our listener to hold on to?
I think it's this. Solomon's story reminds us that wisdom isn't just about knowledge or success. It's about living a life guided by principles that endure, even in the face of temptation and adversity. It's about recognizing our own foreign gods, those things we chase after that ultimately leave us empty. And it's about remembering that even when we stumble, even when we stray from our path, there's always a possibility of returning, of seeking redemption, of finding our way back to what truly matters.
Beautifully put. And on that note, we'd like to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into life and lessons of King Solomon. We hope his story has sparked some reflection, some introspection, and maybe even some inspiration as you navigate your own journey through life. Until next time, keep seeking wisdom, keep questioning, and keep striving to live a life of purpose and meaning.